your eyes for the brokenhearted. That's what we're going to talk about this morning as we continue our series on having eyes to see. And if you've been here for the whole series, you know we began by talking about having eyes to see the need. That was kind of a 30,000-foot view of the need that there is in the world today. And then we looked at the need in our own lives, in ourselves, that there is needs that we have, and also the need to serve others. And then last week we looked at that need to have eyes to see Jesus, the real Jesus, the love, the compassion, the caring, the generous Jesus, the Jesus that has a plan to meet the needs of all the people in the world through us. But today we're going to look at the need to have eyes to see the brokenhearted who are really all around us. And this one may be the greatest need of all because so many times we just don't see them. It's not that we don't want to see them, it's just that we don't. We don't really see them on our streets and in our lives anywhere. The truth is, we just don't see them. We don't see their humanity. We tend to look at those who have living in poverty, those who are poor, and we tend to see them, isn't this true? We tend to see them as projects, not as a person. You know, something that we have to do for them. They have a need, they're poor, they're out of the society, and we need to care for them. In fact, many times what we view a person who's living in poverty to be is kind of our responsibility. We have this need, this responsibility to look after them. They're the poor, they're the disenfranchised. We got to look after them. And sometimes we even look at them as being the lazy. You know, that they're just not willing to work. In fact, a study of Canadians shows that 50% of Canadians believe that the poor could work if they wanted to work. I've been in that group. You look at them and think, well, they could get a job, they could do something. And as a result, 25% of Canadians believe that the reason they can't get a job because the poor are lazy. They're just not willing to work. And when we view those in poverty, when we view the homeless in these terms, it really does turn them into projects, something we've got to care for. We just don't see them. We don't see the person. We don't see them as a peer, as another person with hopes and dreams like we have. We throw some money at them. We give some food to them. We give some shelter to them. But that's about it. We just don't see them, not just their need, but seeing them. In fact, Shay Claiborne, who is very much a part of the small group studies that we are doing right now based on Eyes to See, he is going to say something to you this week in your small group that is really kind of alarming. At least it was alarming to me when I first heard him say this. Here's what you'll hear him say. He said, I had come to see that the great tragedy in the church is not that rich Christians, and remember, we're rich Christians. Remember, we in North America, we're in the top 2% of the wealthy of the world. So we rich Christians, it's not that we don't care about the poor, but that the rich Christians do not know the poor. Not that we don't care, it's just that we don't know. He says, I truly believe that when the rich meet the poor, riches will have no meaning. And when the rich meet the poor, we will see poverty come to an end. Is he right? He says Christians don't know the poor. We don't know them. We know about them, but we don't know them. Is that true? Well, let's answer this question. Do you know the name of a single homeless person? I don't. You know, in 2005, our church started what's called Christmas Downtown. And we have, for 13 years, been taking a bunch of volunteers downtown and feeding some homeless people, anywhere from 150 to 300 homeless people or poor people, a full-course turkey dinner. We tell them the Christmas story, and we give them a little gift. And I don't know if any of you have been at all 13, or maybe at least some of you I know have been at 3, 4, 5 of them. But I do know this, if you've been at more than one, you begin to recognize some of the faces because they're year after year. And yet, even though we recognize their faces, how many of us know their name? How many of us have ever taken one of those homeless persons out for coffee and a muffin or for lunch sometime after the Christmas Downtown event? My answers would be none and none. I haven't done that. And as a result, if you look at what I think of the homeless people and the poor people, I see them as projects and not as a person. That's what I'd have to conclude because I don't know their name. I've never really developed a relationship with them. I treat them as something that we need to care for, and so we give food to them, and we give money to them, and we give some clothing to them, and we give them some gifts, but we don't know them. It's very impersonal. It's just a sharing. I mean, how many of us have given much of ourselves to them? And how many of us have really allowed them to give much of themselves to us? Not very much, because it's very impersonal. We go down and we leave and it's over. Someone did a study and asked some Rwanda women who basically lived on less than $2 a day. And they asked them, would you describe poverty for us? You live in poverty. You have a better idea of what poverty really is. Would you define poverty for us? And they named 5 things that were true of people living in poverty. And the interesting thing about those 5 things is that most of us never even realized it. Here's the 5 things. They may surprise you. They said poverty is an empty heart, not an empty bowl, an empty heart. They said poverty is not knowing your abilities or your strengths. Poverty is not being able to make progress in life. Poverty is isolation from the rest of society. Poverty is having no hope or belief in yourself. And the sad truth is that almost all of the ventures that are put forward to help those living in poverty really don't address any of these things. Does Christmas Downtown really address these 5 main characteristics of poverty? Not really. We may address isolation for a little bit and that we bring them kind of in with us, but for a short time, but it's only for a short time. And I'm not knocking Christmas Downtown. You hear me? I think it's a great thing. We started it 13 years ago because we did want to help those living in poverty. We wanted to actually do something tangible, not just send money. We wanted to do something tangible. It's a great ministry. But I've come to realize that maybe it didn't go far enough. Maybe it didn't get down to the real heart of the issue. Because poverty isn't just not having enough food to eat, and it's not simply, not having good clothes or warm clothes to wear or having a good place to live. But poverty is being dehumanized and demoralized. It's losing your sense of self-worth and self-value. It was Mother Teresa who said this: the poverty of being unwanted and unloved and uncared for is the greatest poverty. That's an amazing statement. It's the greatest poverty. And if truth were known, the fact is that most people living in poverty in Ottawa, in Canada, and around the world are experiencing this kind of poverty in their life. So what's the solution? What do we do? How can we change our approach to those living in poverty? How can we go from seeing them as a project to seeing them as a person, to seeing them as a peer, to seeing them as somebody who has the same kind of wants and desires that we have? How can we go from just seeing their need to actually seeing them as a person? How do we do that? Well, fortunately, there is an amazing example that if we will follow, will help us to do that very thing. And that example, of course, is Jesus. Jesus is the example. He was amazing in working with those living in poverty, so good that the people living in poverty literally followed him wherever he went. I mean, he must have done something right, and he did. What he did is he treated them as peers. He treated them as people and not as projects. He showed love to them. In fact, the real secret to his working with the people living in poverty was that he treated their real need and not just their perceived need. We tend to deal with a perceived need and not the real need. Well, let me show you what I mean about Jesus. There was a day during Jesus' ministry when a person who had leprosy came to him. Now leprosy is a terrible disease. We all know that. But in Jesus' time, it was a life-destroying disease. Because if you had leprosy, you were kind of isolated from the rest of the world. You couldn't live in your own home. You couldn't live in a friend's home. You couldn't stay even in town. You had to get outside of town, outside the borders of town, and live out there all by yourself unless there were some other lepers out there. And you couldn't live with anyone else. And nobody wanted to touch you. No one would touch you because you had this terrible disease. And so you were very isolated. And if you ever wanted to come into town for something, you always had to come in yelling loudly, unclean, unclean, because people didn't want to get near you. They didn't want you even to brush up against them and just touch their sleeve because they're afraid they might get it from you. And so wherever you went, you had to do this dehumanizing gesture of calling out, unclean, unclean. And as you shouted that, the people would just quickly move away from you. It was like you were living in an isolated bubble. No one would get close to you. No one wanted to talk to you, and certainly nobody would touch you. It was a terrible disease. And Matthew, who was a tax collector, turned disciple of Jesus Christ, fortunately wrote down so much of the ministry of Jesus Christ so that we know exactly what happened. And he recorded this story about this leper. And in his story, he records it that there was a large crowd following Jesus that day, which was true all the time. But there was this large crowd following him, which if you know leprosy and know that day and age, you know, therefore, that this poor man was not in that crowd. He was way beyond the crowd. He wasn't at the edge of the crowd. No one would let him be at the edge of the crowd. He was way back from the crowd. He could barely see, and he couldn't probably see Jesus because of the crowd that was around him. If he wanted to see Jesus, he had to make his way through that crowd. And he had to do that by yelling, unclean, unclean. And that's exactly what he did. Now, on this particular day, it kind of served his purposes because as he yelled, unclean, unclean, the crowd began to part. It was kind of like the parting of the Red Sea. He'd yell unclean, and he'd keep parting, and he kept yelling. How demoralizing that must have been. How embarrassing to keep yelling, unclean, 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 until he finally found himself right at the front of the crowd. There he was, and there was Jesus. And Matthew records it this way. He says, he approached Jesus, and knelt before him. Lord, the man said, if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean. This guy was in a desperate position. But he was a man of faith. If you are willing, I know you can. He had great faith. And here's how Jesus responded. Jesus reached out and touched him. I am willing, he said, be healed. And instantly the leprosy disappeared. Can you imagine what that must have been like for that man? I mean, he walks through the crowd yelling, unclean, unclean, and he leaves yelling, I'm healed, I'm healed. I mean, his skin went from that awful white and flaking to that nice olive color that people from that part of the country would have. He was instantaneously healed. He was instantaneously welcomed back into the city. He instantaneously could return to his family. It was an amazing thing, and everybody witnessed it and saw this amazing miracle. But you want to know something? There was an even greater, in my opinion, an even greater miracle that happened that day. And it happened before Jesus healed him. Look at what he says here. It says here, Jesus reached out and touched him. Before he was healed, Jesus touched him. Can you imagine what that must have been like for that leper who had never been touched for so long? As long as he had the disease, I don't know whether it was weeks, months, or years, he had never felt the warmth of a human touch. Never. Not from his spouse, not from his kids. Nobody had touched him. And you know what it's like to be deprived of a human touch. Babies that are deprived of a human touch, it affects them so emotionally, and it affects anybody emotionally. His spirit was broken. You know, his soul was broken because nobody had touched him. They had so isolated him, and yet Jesus, before he ever says, I will heal you, he reaches out and he touches him. The crowd must have been in shock when they watched Jesus reach out and touch that man, because nobody does that. The priests didn't. Nobody would do that. And yet Jesus reached out and touched him, and instantly his soul, his spirit was healed. And so that day, he was totally healed. He was a brand new man because of the human touch of Jesus. And when I think of the way that Jesus dealt with this man living in poverty, and I compare it to the way we, or at least I, respond to people living in poverty, I'm embarrassed and I'm ashamed. Because, see, Jesus reached out and touched him. I don't like to do that. Do you? You know, sometimes, many times, those who are homeless, they're dirty, they smell, they might have lice, and you just don't want to touch them. I want to feed them, I want to clothe them, I want to give money for their care and look after them, but to literally touch them? And you know something, I might shake their hand, but to really embrace them? And I'm pretty sure that they're kind of used to that. Because how many hugs does a homeless person get in a day, a week, a month, or a year? And yet if I really, really knew them, if I knew them, if I really saw them and not just their need, I'm pretty sure that I would discover that deep inside them, there is this overwhelming desire and this overwhelming need for someone, just someone, to really see them as a peer, really see them as a person, and reach out and touch them as Jesus did. And that got me to thinking, what would have happened? What difference would it have made if when we started Christmas Downtown 13 years ago, we kind of just touched them and we engaged them in conversation, not just for a few moments that night, but actually engaged them in conversation, actually got to know them. What if we began to develop a relationship with them? What if instead of it being just one night, we actually invited them out to coffee periodically so that we could have coffee and share a muffin together and hear their story being told? What if we had done that? What if everybody that goes down to Christmas Downtown just picked 2 or 3 people out and just developed a relationship with them for the next year? Not just one time, but for the whole year. What if we began to help them discover the abilities and strengths that they have? Well, what if we help them to feel a whole lot less isolated because they're with us and we're going downtown and we're going into Tim Hortons and we're sitting down with everybody else and just having coffee and having a muffin? Well, what if we began to help them make progress in their development and give them hope? Well, what if we began to treat them as peers, not as projects? Would that have made any difference in the lives of the homeless people and the poor people we touched through Christmas Downtown? I understand. I've read this week even that as Canadians, we tend to be more generous with our money and our resources, but detached relationally. We're not a huggy, touchy-feely people, though. We like our space, and in fact, we guard our space. We want to protect our space. I read this week that we are task-oriented rather than relational-oriented as people. That's the way we are. But then I began to think, well, what happens? What would happen if we move beyond that? We like to give our money rather than to act. We like to give our money rather than, we're glad to give money. We're glad to send, we care. Evidenced by the fact that we gave $3,037 in one Sunday to buy food cards for those who are suffering from the tornado. We care. It's just that we want to care from a distance. We want to give money to somebody to be the Good Samaritan. We just don't want to be the Good Samaritan. Isn't that true? And yet the truth is, if we got to know them, it's the relational part of our connection with them that they value the most. You see, the truth is, just like you and me, more than anything else, they want to experience a human touch. They want to have a conversation with a peer. They want to develop a friendship. And so they want these things. But the truth is, it is that relationship that will only fulfill or satisfy these needs in their life. It is only that, by a relational relationship that we have, that we fill an empty heart. Giving them food won't fill an empty heart. Giving them a new change of clothes won't fill an empty heart. But a relationship, taking the time. I wonder what would happen if, we picked out 2 or 3 of those people and once a month, maybe the first Sunday of every month, we invited them to come to church with us, to the bridge. Went down and picked them up, brought them here, sat with them in church, and then took them out to Swiss Chalet after. I wonder what difference that would make. Because inside, that's what fills an empty heart. It's what helps them to be able to find their abilities and their strengths. It helps them to know if they're making progress. It'll fulfill the problem of isolation in their life. And it will give them hope and belief in themselves. If we would just see them, if we would just reach out and touch them, if we just developed a relationship with them. Oh, that God would give us eyes to see. To see the poor as our peers. To see our poor as people who are just like us. One of our volunteers that works in the Canada food cupboard, as we do that every 6 weeks, I believe, they were working in the food cupboard one night, and one of the clients came and began a conversation with them. And this client began to share with them that, that not long ago they were working in the high-tech industry, but they had got laid off, as many have. And he found himself in a desperate situation. As you know, most people live paycheck to paycheck. And high-tech pays a lot, and usually therefore they've got a lot of debt. And they've got a lot of payments to make. And when you lose that kind of a job, it's hard to replace it quickly. And he said, I found myself all of a sudden in a place I never dreamed I would be in, short of money. And he said, to top it all off and to make it even worse, my son, who worked in the same industry, had the very same thing happen to him at the same time. And being parents, you who are parents know this, when something bad happens to your kids, you want to help them, so they're trying to help their kids while they themselves are going through this difficult situation, which made their situation even worse. And he began to apologize to our volunteer that he was there. But he said, I didn't know where else to go. I didn't know where else to turn. In the midst of this great need, where was I to go? What was I supposed to do? And so he was apologizing. He was saying how ashamed he was to have to be there. Before he used to contribute to it. Now he's there receiving that. But he didn't know what else to do. That man shared his story with our volunteer because that man wanted him to know that he wasn't there because he was lazy. He wasn't there because he wasn't willing to work. He wasn't there because he was trying to take advantage of the system. He was there because he came and found himself in a most unfortunate situation beyond his control, and he had to come. And receiving a welcoming ear and a sense of empathy, I believe that conversation was worth more to that man than the groceries that he took home. I believe he took home more than groceries that day. He took home a little bit of dignity that he had lost. He took home a little bit of self-worth and value that he'd lost because he'd been treated as a peer. He had been treated with compassion. He had had a conversation, and the person he had a conversation with understood that he was a human being caught in a bad situation who needed some help. Oh, that we had eyes to see the brokenhearted. Oh, that we could see that behind every example of poverty, there is a story longing to be told. There is a person longing to be understood. And there's a heart longing to be loved. Oh, that we had eyes to see them. To see them. To see that they are a person who needs to be touched, to be hugged, to be valued, to be given a little bit of empathy. Oh, that we had eyes to look beyond their need and see them. And then had the courage to actually do something about it. Not judge them. Not just treat them as a project, but to love them and care for them and to give them dignity. So my question to you in closing is this. What are you going to do? what are you going to do with this message I've just shared with you? You can kind of, shove it to the back of your mind and walk out of here and try not to think about it again until you see that person on the corner begging. You can agree that we should do that kind of stuff, but never really do anything about it. Never really change how you live. Or you can agree that this is true and you can begin to ask God to open your eyes that you might see the brokenhearted as your peers, as your fellow human beings who need not just your food and your clothing, but more importantly, need you. Need a relationship with you, need your love, need your compassion, need your empathy. So what are you going to do? These are the questions I want you to talk about in your small group this week as we study eyes to eyes across the city and throughout the valley. Ask these questions, answer these questions. If you're not in one of our small groups, find some time today and ask yourself these questions. Answer them honestly. What am I going to do with this truth? Am I just going to try to forget about it and ignore it because it's difficult? Or am I actually going to stop and ask God to open my eyes and help me to see them? Not just their need, but to see them and to act in love and compassion and humanity. Let's pray. Father in heaven, you have given us an unbelievable opportunity. You have given us the opportunity to be your hands that would reach out to somebody that's in need and to do what you did with a man with leprosy, actually touch them. Not just shake their hand, but touch them, to give them a hug, put an arm around their shoulder, and give them empathy, and give them compassion, and give them part of ourselves. Father, that's who you are. That's what you did. And we who are your followers are called to do the very same thing that you did. And so this is our calling. Forgive us, forgive me that I have been hesitant to reach out and touch. Give me a heart of compassion. Give me a heart of love and of empathy for those who, for whatever reason, find themselves in a difficult place in life. And as we reach out and touch them, as we reach out and put our arm around their shoulder, may the love of Jesus Christ so fill their hearts and their lives that in you they will find the dignity that they have lost. In you they will find the hope that they've never been able to find. And in you may they find the one who loves them more than anyone else in all the world. Thanks, Father, for giving us the opportunity. Help us to seize it with both hands and do everything that we can to love those who are just like us, only living in less fortunate situations. For we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.